Hello and welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today we're going to be talking about 5 centuries of Christian literature. Now some people would argue, and I don't think that they're wrong, that all literature is reflective of the story, God's story for mankind, whether in aspects of the nature of humanity, or the redemption of humanity, or the hope for an eternal future, or the love of God, or creation, any of those things. That's true. You can find facets of God's story in every story. But today I want to talk specifically about books that deal with biblical or Christian themes, either from a meta-narrative perspective or dealing with more minute details of the Christian life or Christian virtue, etc. The reason that I started thinking about this was because last weekend, my sister and I got to see a performance of The Pilgrim's Progress at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And it was a wonderful play, a great performance. We both thoroughly enjoyed it. And it got me to thinking about other books of Christian literature that have existed for many centuries, ones that I have read and ones that I want to read, and the rich heritage that we have as believers in this treasury of stories that specifically illustrate biblical themes, like I said, whether on a big perspective or in minute detail. And so I made a whole list of books that I have read and also books that I want to read that are Christian in their very nature, by nature of their subject and the author's personal views, etc. So first of all, if you ever get a chance to see a performance by the Academy of the Arts, they have performances in South Carolina and also at the Museum of the Bible and at the Ark in Kentucky. If you ever get a chance to see one of them, highly recommend. This year their season is full of classic works on the stage, like they did Secret Garden, and I think they have done The Scarlet Pimpernel. They do all kinds of classic works of literature, including Christian and otherwise, and really fantastic performance, at least the one that we saw. My in-laws saw, I think it was Prince Caspian that they did most recently, prior to Pilgrim's Progress, and they thoroughly enjoyed it as well. So anyway, onto my list of books. So we're going to go all the way back to the 16th century and talk about an epic poem by an Englishman named Edmund Spenser. Edmund Spenser lived during the time of Queen Elizabeth of England, and he wanted to write a really great English version of an epic poem in the style of the Odyssey or something like that. And he wanted it to be very English because he was English, and you know how the English are about being English. He wanted it to be very English. He wanted it to honor and represent Queen Elizabeth, and he wanted it to be Christian, specifically Protestant in nature. So he wrote The Fairy Queen. Originally, he wanted it to be 12 volumes, but he was only able to do 6 in his lifetime. And each volume was representative of a different virtue. I read the first one, which was about the Red Knight. And the Red Knight was basically on a journey of salvation or sanctification and maturity in his Christian walk. And he has to learn a lot of things along the way. It was very allegorical in the sense that each character in the story represents something in particular. And it was much easier to read than I anticipated. It definitely has archaic language and archaic spellings, so it was helpful to read an edition that explained all of that and kind of illuminated some things that might be cloudy for someone like me who is not well versed in literary traditions and the things that came before his poem that he was working off of. So that was helpful. So it's not necessarily an easy read per se, but it was very enjoyable and it was very impactful, and it was important because it affected much of the English literature that came after it. So it was a crucial piece, not only in Christian literature, but in literature as a whole and the development of literature. In fact, it had a definite influence on the next book that I want to mention, which is from the 17th century, and that is The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which is what got me thinking about all of this in the first place. There are very strong correlations between the Fairy Queen and the Pilgrim's Progress. In some ways, they're the same story. And instead of being a red knight, we have a pilgrim who is on his journey to the celestial city and all of the things that he encounters on his way there. And it's very representative of the Christian life and the Christian walk and the journey to eternity. Again, it has some archaic older language. It's easier to read. It's not in poetry form, it's more in prose form. But if you've read Shakespeare, it would be very similar to that. I think it would be around the same time period, and definitely worth the time and the effort that it takes to read it for a believer. There's also a younger children's version, which I read when my children were younger, which is a lot easier to understand. But the original is definitely worth the time it takes to read it. And if you can see an adaptation of it, there is an animated one that is, I believe, narrated by Kristen Getty. That is really good as well. That sticks to the story. That also helps with understanding it if you find it difficult to read. But I read The Pilgrim's Progress many years ago, I believe. I think I read it for school or at some point in my teenage years. And then I read it, the children's version, to my children. And then I read it myself, the regular version, some years ago, and really thoroughly enjoyed it when I read it. And then also from the 17th century, we have Paradise Lost by John Milton, which I've talked a lot about recently. And that one is another epic poem that it is telling the story of the creation of the world and the fall of the angels and then the fall of mankind and the resulting aftermath. And the last part of it looks towards the future, what God ends up doing with mankind. So Paradise Lost was so much more interesting than I even expected it to be. It was easier to read than I expected it to be, although I did find it helpful to read an annotated version that illuminated, again, some things that I would not have picked up on my own and made connections that I would not have made otherwise and explained some more archaic vocabulary and terminology. And also there are some like poetic devices in there that is helpful to see, to understand a little bit better. So I really enjoyed Paradise Lost, and it definitely is a biblical story. John Milton is embellishing and adding to and imagining some things because, you know, the Bible says in very brief sentences things that Milton was taking pages and pages and pages to describe. So he definitely imagines into the story things that are not strictly biblical, but he's not straying from what the Bible says in that sense. And then moving forward, the 18th century was an amazing time of a lot of religious nonfiction that was printed and published, and religious poetry and all manner of Christian publications, including Christian literature. Just a couple that I will mention. One is The Vicar of Wakefield, which I have talked about recently on this channel as well. And that one is more exploratory of Christian virtues as they apply to living Christian life, particularly prudence and wisdom, and also hope and I don't know what word you want to say, steadfastness, I guess, maybe, or whatever, in the face of trial and adversity, based on the hope that we have in the future of eternity. So that one is an interesting one. Some people interpret The Vicar of Wakefield as being ironic and kind of satirical about religion and Christianity. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think that the author is strictly being satirical about Christianity, but there is definitely some ironical elements in it and some satire, especially in the first half of it. But I think that is his way of emphasizing the need for prudence and wisdom and discernment in living the Christian life, in exercising Christian life. And then also from the 18th century, we have Robinson Crusoe, which again can be difficult to read in the context of the language being kind of old. My sons both read it in 6th grade, and at that age, it was very, very difficult for them to read. But I will say that both of them, looking back on it, reflect on it as being a good book that they read. I don't know that either of them would say that it was their favorite. I remember when they read it, that they read it with blood and sweat and tears, pretty much, because it was difficult to understand. My younger son, we actually, some of the chapters, we listened to audio while he was reading with his eyes because he was having such trouble understanding it. But now, when we talk about it, you know, I'm thinking that they will remember how difficult it was to read. They actually remember that they really loved the story. There's at some point in the story, they really got hooked on it. And it was interesting to them to the end, enough that it gave them a positive perspective looking back on the story. So if you're reading it and you're struggling with it halfway through, just keep going. And I think that it will be worth it in the end. And it's definitely a clear picture of Daniel Defoe was clearly illustrating redemption and salvation in this story. And he wrote some other books as well that are along similar themes. I've read one other by him, I think, but I haven't read all of his. And yes, I believe that once he became a believer, my understanding, if I remember correctly from what I learned about him, Daniel Defoe, once he became a believer, like he really wanted to tell stories that illustrated that truth. And then we're moving forward into much more modern literature that's a lot easier for us to read as 21st century Americans or other English-speaking people. And we get to the era of Austen in the early 19th century. And Austen was a Christian, and that definitely shines through in all of her works. But I think her most Christian novel that actually tackles Christian themes specifically is Mansfield Park, which I reread earlier this year. I talked a lot about it, so I won't say a lot more, but it's definitely about a girl who is, it's definitely in defense of the church and of Christianity in some ways. And it's also about the virtue of, I guess, all of the virtues, all of the Christian virtues embodied in Fanny, faced up against the vice of the various vices of mankind, including greed and sensuality and all of that kind of stuff. Austen tackles the topic of vice and virtue in her stories in one way or the other, but it's really, really obvious in Mansfield Park. And then you have Edmund, who is the hero of the story, who is a clergyman and is going up against Mary Crawford, who is against the church and against the clergy, etc. And we see what happens to her versus what happens to Edmund. Edmund ends up, you know, victorious, so to speak. I mean, there's not really like a great drama that's going on in this sense of the story. It's not like great battles. It's not epic like the Red Knight happens in Fairy Queen, but it's definitely a story that is exalting, if you will, virtue and the value of the church in a person's life. And then later in the 19th century, we have the Bronte sisters, who were all daughters of a clergyman, and that definitely comes through in all of their works. In particular, Jane Eyre has a lot of Christian themes. It's not as Christian on the surface as Agnes Grey or The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which are written by Anne Bronte, and definitely deal more with outright, outspoken Christianity, if that makes sense, and living life Christianly in a godly way. But Jane Eyre is doing the same thing, perhaps a little more subtly, and also dealing with really big ideas of biblical themes. And again, pitting vice against virtue and the strength that is required to live a virtuous life in the face of temptation. And it really is a masterful dealing with the issues. And in the end, Jane Eyre is kind of similar to Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, in that she has to make very difficult choices, potentially to her own detriment, in order to live by what is right, what she knows is true, what is virtuous, what is good, and in the end triumphs over temptation and over evil, and wins other people along with her in the process. And then we have the only one here on my list, I think that was not originally written in English, and that is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Now, there are others. I would definitely put some Russian novels in this list, particularly by Tolstoy, and then later in the 20th century, let's say by Dostoevsky and some others. And there are others that we could put on this list as being Christian, but these are just ones that I particularly really read and enjoyed. And Les Miserables is the only one on this list that is not originally written in English, and has very strong themes of redemption and mercy and grace and justice, and also has a lot to say about the politics of the church and the failure of the church, particularly as he was concerned, the Catholic Church in France, the failure of the church to live out the principles of Christianity as demonstrated by Jesus Christ. And so he has his kind of like prototype ideal priest or bishop in the bishop character at the beginning of the story, and his kind of idealized version of what Christianity should look like in a person's life. And then Jean Valjean goes on to exemplify a redeemed person who is completely transformed and changed by the grace and mercy extended to him. So that one has very strong Christian themes as well. And then also in the 19th century, a lot of Victorian authors explored Christian concepts or issues of morality to one extent or another. So you could mention a lot of them from this era in a list like this. Many of them I have read, but I'll just point out a couple. First of all, Charlotte M. Yonge was definitely specifically writing from an Anglican perspective. She was definitely writing Christian books from a Christian perspective about Christian issues. And The Heir of Redcliffe is one that I read earlier this year, and is again, talking about this issue of virtue versus vice. But also I feel like she is comparing, in the parable that Jesus told about the tax collector, the publican, and the Pharisee. And that's definitely the story that she's telling here. She's drawing from that theme of a publican versus a Pharisee, someone who looks good on the outside, but inside is a mess, or versus someone who doesn't look good at the outside, but is actually becomes a much stronger, better person, down on by the Pharisee type character, but sees in humility his own worthlessness and how he has been saved and helped. So I have not read other books by Charlotte M. Yonge, but I believe that they're all definitely written similarly with a desire to emphasize the Christian faith and idealize it to a certain extent. And then we have Elizabeth Gaskell, who was a Congregationalist and a dissenter at the time, as she was called. And the one that I read most recently has really, really strong messages for the church, and that is Ruth. And she's definitely exploring the concept of mercy and grace and love and its form in the redemptive work in a person's life, and the way that we as Christians can reach out to other people and be a part of God's working in their lives by the way that we treat them with grace and mercy, etc. And then we move on to the 20th century, and of course, C.S. Lewis ranks really high on this list. So he wrote many novels that all have some sort of Christian theme to them, some of them more obvious than others. The Narnia series, for example, Aslan, the lion, definitely has strong parallels to Jesus and the life of Christ. And there are other parallels of the Christian life and sin and temptation. He's like definitely exploring a lot of Christian ideas and themes through the various characters in his book and the various situations that are encountered in the whole series. And then we have also the Screwtape Letters, which is about demons exchanging letters about how best to tempt Christians, has strong Christian themes. The Great Divorce is an exploration, like a fantastical exploration of heaven and hell and what the afterlife is like. Not really, kind of like heaven as it is right now, not the future new heaven and earth, but like, what is it like right now? And what if people right now who have passed on and ended up in one or the other, what if they could visit the other side, and what would they do? And that's one of the most profound Christian books that I have read personally. I really love The Great Divorce. And he has written many others, and I want to get to all of them eventually, but those are the ones I have read and really loved. And then also Christie was written, and this was a true story, but it was fictionalized. So the book Christie by Catherine Marshall is a fictionalized account of a young girl who becomes a missionary in the mountains of North Carolina, I believe. And just the way that she is impacted by the lives of the people there, how she impacts them, and also how she is influenced by a Quaker woman who is a missionary to the people in those mountains. And really a profound and very moving book with strong Christian themes all throughout it, on a variety of levels, about God working through Alice Henderson, who is the Quaker woman, and Chrissy Huddleston, who is the eponymous title character. Really wonderful book. If you ever have a chance to read it, read it. Also from the 20th century, The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, which again is a true story, but it's told in a story format. It's easy to read. I haven't read it in a long time, but I really want to reread it at some point, and has strong themes of faith and forgiveness in the face of unimaginable trauma. And forgiveness definitely is a huge theme in that book. It's a very Christian idea. So those are, in particular, the books that I have read and enjoyed in the long history of Christian novels and literature. There are some that I have not read that I want to, and there's a couple that I have DNF'd, actually. One is In His Steps by, I believe it was Charles Sheldon, and that one was a hard DNF. I don't think I'll ever pick that one up again. It was just too contrived. I think it has a good message, and that's where we get the whole, what would Jesus do? That phase, Becca Chogo, the WWJD bracelets and all of that stuff. That book raises the question, as we go through our daily lives as Christians, to think, what would Jesus do? But it was just so contrived. And there was a lot of telling rather than showing. I didn't read very much of it. I don't know. I probably got 5 chapters in or something. I don't know. 3 chapters. I don't know. I gave up on it, and I don't have any interest in picking it back up again. And then another one which was a soft DNF. At some point I would like to read this one, and that is Hind's Feet on High Places by Hannah Bernard, I think. And I started that when I was much younger, probably good 20 plus years ago. And I just didn't get into it. I just put it down because I guess I was bored by it. But I would like to try that one again. I think that one would definitely be worth reading. And then there are some other authors that I want to try. George MacDonald. I have read one by him, Fantastes, and it was very good. But I want to read some others by him. He has a lot of books. He was a Scottish Presbyterian, I guess. I mean, Scottish usually are. I don't know, I think. But anyways, all of his books have, I believe, strong Christian themes in them. And I just haven't read them yet, but I do want to. And then G.K. Chesterton is another one that I haven't read yet. So I want to get to his works as well. And then, I'm ashamed to say this, but J.R.R. Tolkien also. I've only read one and a part of a book by him. I do want to read them. I do. you know, fantasy isn't really my thing. It doesn't really appeal to me, so I haven't yet, but I want to. So those are the books from the rich heritage of Christian literature. What books would you add to this list? This is by no means exhaustive. You could add so many books to this list by Christian authors of the past centuries. Which ones would you add to this list? Which ones of these have you read and really enjoyed that you would recommend to other people? And which one do you wish that more people would read? Or which ones have you not read and you would like to read and like to try them? So let's talk in the comments. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And until next time, bye.